Good afternoon. My name is Juan Martínez, and my partner's name is Camila Mejía-Vélez. Today we're going to have a very nice talk, not in a traditional way, but on a kind of a dialogue in which we are going to introduce the topic and develop it. Then welcome to our talk, which is called Critical Literacy in Early Childhood Language Education as a Strategy for Social Justice in Latin America. Well, as I've been telling you, what we're going to have is a short and nice dialogue in which you're going to be introduced to the topic. And then by the end of our talk, you will be welcome to ask more questions to both of us. So let's just start with the context. Yes. So I believe that in Colombia, we've got too many issues, and Latin America probably got very similar issues. And everybody's being affected. Adults, adolescents, children, right? Those problems, those issues are not only focused on education. We have too many cultural, political, economic issues that are affecting education as such. So let's try to figure out our context in order to understand what we're planning to do, what we're projecting with this idea of critical literacy. Maria Camila, what can you tell us about the context in Latin America?
All right, Juan. So I'm not going to spend a lot talking about all the different problems, political, social, cultural, economical problems that these countries share, but rather I'm going to focus a little bit on the children's context. And one reality that I would like to stress in today's presentation is that Latin American countries are still only halfway to guaranteeing children's safety. And we are neglecting and we're not supporting them to exercise their rights. We are not offering social protections and other aspects that ensure their well-being and their welfare. Just to name some examples and just to give you a little bit of an idea of what's going on, this is some statistics by UNICEF 2019, in which it was demonstrated that Latin America and the Caribbean region can be classified as the most unequal region in the world. Around 69 million children are living in poverty. They are experiencing violence at home or school as a form of discipline or punishment, which is something that people will argue that is something cultural, but definitely is not. Around 7 million migrant children are on their own due to violent conflicts, such as the wars that we have lived in many of the countries part of this region. Roughly 24,500 children are victims of homicide, and 15 out of 19 girls experience rape, including when they are in their early childhood. And 6 out of 10 children in their early years who received education belong to high social classes. So if we look at these statistics, we see that education seems to be only for the privileged children that has access for paying for a private school, and public school is still facing a lot of difficulties to ensure that children are being protected and educated properly.
Maria Camila, but you have said we are halfway, so it means there's been a progress in education, deal with basically early childhood education. We can notice that lots of the efforts, plenty of government efforts have been focusing on superior education, high school education, but we can probably say that early childhood is being neglected a bit, but we're still halfway. So it means that we are improving a bit part of our system, right? Or is that wrong?
Well, one of the things that we're going to cover in today's presentation is precisely that. We can see in the research agenda and in all the interventions, policy making, that children are not at the top of the list. They are rather forgotten And there are communities that are still facing in their daily lives, they are facing all of these social issues. They are facing violence, they are facing rape, they are facing a lot of political discourses on the books that they read, on the TV shows that they watch, and they are not receiving any support or any guidance to cope and to make sense of all of these political discourses that reinforce other social problematics, such as discrimination on the basis of sex, gender. So I will say it's rather wrong, Juan.
So by wrong, you mean that we haven't lost the things to get improved, but there are some people, some scholars like you probably, who are just aiming at improving early childhood education based on this type of theory, which is very interesting, dealing with critical pedagogy, right?
Yes, there's still much to do, and definitely children need to be a priority in the research agenda and in the whole, and for the whole educative community. It can't be only a government's effort. Teachers and educators need to be involved and need to start addressing all of these social issues that children are encountering in their daily lives. Which bring us here together for this presentation, because one of the things that we want to establish in this presentation is perhaps one of the strategies that can be used to help children get empowered of the realities and kind of fight back in their ways, in their own ways, fight back all of the difficulties that they face on a daily basis, and all the literacy practices and political literacy practices that they have to deal with without much guidance.
So, all in all, just to wrap up this information of the context, we can notice that we're having many issues: social, political, economic, educational issues, right? But we are still working in the process of how to improve that. So it means that even though we've got some theories, a lot of devices, multimodal devices in order to improve education, we're still lacking something, right? From our perspective, I believe that education got stuck at a certain point, and we started just running traditional processes of education. So when we're teaching languages, most of us try to help children to learn to decode, right? Just having the view of the language isolated to the context. Even though they're in a context, I'm not saying that it's wrong. What I'm saying is it's completely right. That language goes beyond just the mere code, just the more traditional perspective of it. It's not just subject plus verb plus complement, but there's something beyond that. There's some of the lies that we have to unveil and try to see what is beyond that. Do you consider we're still we're still using traditional perspectives of education in our classes in early childhood education?
I will dare to argue that yes, there is still a great population of people who conceives reading and writing in a traditional way, especially when it comes to children, because we tend to underestimate children's capacity to make sense of their literacy practices. And this is something that responds to, as you were mentioning, to a traditional view, or we can also say a prescriptivist view of literacy pedagogy, in which literacy is conceived only as the ability to decode and reproduce the written words. This source of conception also leads to other perspectives of language, such as the idea of the standardization of language, the belief of what is to be a good reader, which is mainly based on the capacity to decode, like previously started as the capacity to decode canonical text, for example. to be a good writer, meaning that you have a certain command of the grammar, and these visions of what is correct and what is incorrect in the language. So this traditional view fails to understand that literacy is a social practice. And I think we're still working on, from a traditional perspective, in primary school and in early childhood education, because we believe that in the first years is the most important thing to do with children is to help them to decode the language.
So as the perceptions of language evolves, the ways to interact with the language, the learning of the acquisition of a language may evolve at the same time. So previously we used to have some approaches, the grammar approach, right? The communicative approach, task-based approach. Different type of approaches are associated with different type of perspectives of pedagogy. So we've got something understood as literacy pedagogy. In the traditional view, as you were just saying it, there's a traditional perspective of it. I mean, decode it, understanding the parts of the speech and trying to get the message and sustain there, what you can certainly see in the surface of the language. But then you're telling us that there's something beyond that, that we can go further, that we can certainly take and open the door to a new universe of the language. And then you call it the descriptivist view. Is that right?
Yes. So the problem with a prescriptivist view in this case is that it does not contemplate the complexities of the communicative practices that children and that people in general have on a daily basis. Now, a more descriptive view of literacy acknowledges that language and reading and writing are social practices, okay, and that it is deeply connected with knowledge, culture, identities, values, politics, economy. You can say any context that any context of our lives. Okay.
So in that sense, we can say there's a social practice. It deals with the students' general competence, as some people may call it in the community bilingual reference, or as the capacities, as Bauman probably call it. And then we can say that the language then is I'm going to quote here, is to be, know, and do. So do you agree with that? So language is not just the linguistic approach of it. It is not the pragmatic or the social linguistic. But there's another stage of language which is going to be something just quite linked to the student's context, to their declarative knowledge, to their realities.
Yes, so it's something that is connected to their individual identities, to their cultural backgrounds and contexts. It is something that embraces different forms of meaning making, social diversities, life experiences, which all of these aspects are an inherent part of what literacy is and what it implies. So it is about understanding that literacy is a practice that people own. Is not something that is restricted to formal education environments. It's something that people practice on a daily basis. We are all the time, we are reading and writing. When we see to watch a TV show, we are reading and writing, and we are exercising our literacy skills. The problem with the traditional view, and I'm going to add a little bit of detail here, is that believing that literacy is only decoding or is only the capacity of reading canonical text is linked to economic and political interests. Okay, so on the one side, this functional view of literacy influence educational institutions to train people to become workers and to meet job market demands, and in other words, just have them passive without thinking so much about the inequality that is present in our day-to-day. On the contrary, this descriptive view of literacy pedagogy intends to equip people to have the capacity of reading and deconstructing the political discourses that are embedded in the text, in the multimodal text, in all of their multimodal forms, in order to be able to deconstruct these political ideologies that are spread and that can end up in social injustice or reinforcing problematic discourses. So it aims to be a practice that is empowering and that contributes to the establishment of justice, and that helps to promote social emancipation, in other words, because people will not be susceptible to subjugation and domination.
Hold on a second. I just want to add two more things there you've been talking about. You were talking about canonical texts, right? But you were also talking about multimodal texts. So what can people be able to read today? Just text at school, or can we read something else? And how can we read that? That's going to be my first question at this moment. The second question is with the fact of justice. I mean, many people say, like, what is Maria Camila talking about? What is that thing about justice in literacy? What is exactly the idea of emancipation with these early childhood education, with these kids in schools, and with those teachers who are helping students to learn a language?
So it is precisely what we were talking about a few minutes ago, that literacy is not only letters, printed letters, okay? So it's not only the printed word what matters for literacy pedagogy. There are many types of forms, and there are many types of make meaning nowadays, and it is a fast changing reality. While in the past we might perhaps we didn't have the digital tools that we have right now, for example, we were not so interconnected as we are right now, and all of that affects all the semiotic resources that we have available to communicate. So nowadays, if you look at your daily life, you will see that you encounter texts in many different forms everywhere. So the TV shows that you watched, the advertisements on the streets, the graffitis that you encounter on the walls, everything is a concern of literacy practices. That is why it's so deeply bonded to culture, and that is why some of these texts are so important. That is why it's so important that schools start recognizing that text and books and reading and writing are activities that do not only happen inside our classroom, it's something that is happening outside. The problem is that there is an author that is called Hilary Janks, one of my favorite authors if you want to get close to critical literacy, and she argues that there are no neutral texts. All the texts have an intention, all texts have a purpose, all texts carry a political ideology. Understanding politics now in the sense of macro politics, like it might come to our heads like democracy or parties, political parties. But we're acknowledging that politics are all those decisions, can be also all those decisions that we make on our daily basis that can have a social impact. For example, Juan, if you look at the social arrangements that each family has in their inner circles, all of those carry political meanings. If there's a home, for example, in which the arrangement is that the mom needs to stay cooking and taking care of the children, and the dad is the one that goes out to work, that is a political arrangement, and that is also concerning with politics. So all the texts that we encounter on a daily basis carry a discourse, if they all have an identity and the capacity to uncover and to unveil all of those meanings is the main concern of literacy pedagogy. That is why we cannot separate literacy, reading and writing. We cannot separate that from politics and economics and identities and culture.
Camila, I would like to say two things here. And I would believe that in the past, people used to think that the unique possibility to read was obviously reading texts, right? Printer paper stuff, right? And people will be able to do that, so they were just developing one tense. Listening to you, can I say that these new perspective of literacy, these new literacy conceptions, are aiming to develop every single type of sense. So it means that we can read words, we can read images, but we can also read music, and we can also read, I don't know, smells. Can we read that? Can we read sounds? Can we touch text? Can we empower students to learn the language through their senses? Is that possible based on this type of perception of new literacies?
Right, Juan. So all of these aspects that you're mentioning now are part of all the semiotic resources that people have available to create text. And as I was mentioning before, all of these semiotic resources carry meanings that are non-neutral and meanings that are, by nature, they are political. That is why we start talking about this concept that is the main interest of our presentation today, which is critical literacy. We have already established that we cannot separate literacy from political discourses, and we cannot separate literacy from culture, identities, economic, and all of the issues that surround society. And this is where we can get started to talk about what's critical literacy, which is mainly that exploration of all these political meanings and how to deconstruct them.
So let's go step by step. So we've got an idea of, I'm sorry about that. I'm really sorry about the sound. We just got from the idea of traditional perspective of literacy. So now we're just getting into something called critical literacy. What I would imagine it comes from critical pedagogy, where there is the progress of it. What sort of perceptions can you just show us in order to understand what critical literacy would be associated to new literacies?
Right, so the first thing that we need to acknowledge when talking about critical literacy is that it acknowledges that literacy plays a political role, that reading and writing play a political role in society, which has the capacity either to favor certain elites or press or exploit social relations. What does it mean? It means that when you encounter a text, we have already said that texts are not neutral and they have a political discourse. Let's perhaps, I'm going to give you one of the most common examples from my experience teaching in primary schools. I have encountered many books in which gender roles or gender perspectives are presented in a very subtle and widely accepted way. Let's look, for example, at the books for kids that address the concept of family. So we always see a traditional family. We teach our children that a family is mom, dad, brother, and sister, right? And that mom is a girl and dad is a boy. Okay, so that's the traditional narrative that we usually present our kids. Now, we are representing a perspective of the world that is restricted in terms of gender, right? And that is why critical literacy is about, because it is not connected to reality and it has a discourse. It has an embedded discourse that we are fitting their ideologies in only one perspective of family. While nowadays we can see that families can be constructed by many different forms. So we've got families, we have gay families, we have single moms, we have single dads, and we are not representing that in the text that we're presenting to our kids nowadays. So they are going to grow up with the idea that what is normal and what it is accepted and what it is correct is that a family must be constructed by male and females only as a partner, or that single moms are perhaps not widely accepted, or single dads is not normal. And that is a political idea that is embedded in the text that we are presenting. So what critical literacy aims here is to help people in this case, and for the purpose of a presentation, help children to be able to deconstruct these political discourses in a way that it is more connected to the reality, and that when they go outside the classroom and they encounter a friend that has two moms, for example, they won't discriminate them on the basis of gender or on the basis of sex. And that is why critical literacy is so important, because a normal text, a simple text, something that is very subtle or something that is so innocent as just presenting a book that for us is normal, can escalate to a further problem while children age and while people age without having enough skills to cope with all of these texts.
So it means students will be able to feel more comfortable when they're reading the text and noticing that a princess is not always white and having blue eyes, but a princess could be brunette, it could black eyes, curly hair. Is that what you're referring to? That there are different possibilities to represent society in different texts.
Yes, but more than that is that critical literacy aims to help people to deconstruct these ideologies. I think there is not a problem if you take a book that only has a perspective of the world, such as in the example I gave you about the family composition. It is not a problem if I guide people to deconstruct these ideologies and to discuss it and to debate and to manage or to get to the conclusion that this might be a problematic view of the world that can end up in oppression and in any other problems, social problems that can escalate, as I said before, it can escalate to inequality, inequity, and violence.
So let me quote here Freire and Marcelo, reading the word and reading the world. So when you read in the word, you have to go beyond the code in order to understand your world. So you're going to find out the importance of your voice, your awareness, your reflection. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, quite interested. So let's imagine that many teachers would say like, well, that would be possible with adolescents and adults, but is it that possible with children? Can children have the capacity, the competence to be aware of political, social, cultural issues?
Okay, so one of the things that I want to establish before we start talking about children in this scenario is that critical literacy ought to become as a means of fighting oppression, and ought to become, so the ultimate goal of critical literacy should be encouraging people to interrogate political ideologies that can end up in the oppression of certain communities or can end up in neglecting certain population, and empowering them to cope with all of these discourses. Now, I'm going to ask you something, Juan. So do you think that all of these social issues that we have covered so far, if you think about your Colombian context, for example, do you think that war inequality, lack of resources, domestic violence, gender inequity are problems that only affect adults or
Of course not.
teenagers.
It affects the society entirely.
Precisely. So it is precisely the main argument of why children need to be also introduced to critical literacy, because they are also affected by this problem. And as we were discussing at the beginning of the presentation, children are victims of our of our Latin American problematics. They are victims of the context. We are not guaranteeing their safety, and they have to cope with war, with violence, with gender inequity, gender roles, etc., without having the skills to make sense of that reality. Okay.
So, Maria Camila, so are we kind of repeating the same cycle? I mean, it's like a vicious cycle, because children nowadays, they will be adolescents in a few years, and then after that, they will be adults, and then we're going to continue with the same process. So it seems that we are on the same cycle. So can we definitely transform society step by step, of course, not just at once, if we try to help children to be aware of these political conditions in order to transform society and improve our way of living? Is that right?
Yes, so we also need to start introducing practices, fair practices in our school that also empowers children, so they can also resist oppression, and they can also deconstruct tags and be able to cope with all the situations that they live on a daily basis. I've got a quote here. Literacy in this sense should be a cultural currency. So it should be a cultural currency distributed in schools without discrimination. So literacy with a political perspective should not be something only for teenagers or for high school. It should be introduced from the very first moment that children get to school, because otherwise problems will escalate. So let's go back, for example, to the situation I was presenting you about the family. So a child will grow up believing that a normal family is with a male brother and sister or whatever. And when they get to high school and they are presented a different narrative, then it's going to be harder.
All right. So let's jump into critical literacy in early childhood. I have had some conversation with some colleagues, and they believe children cannot certainly be aware of the situation, the family situation, or the contextual situation dealing with culture, politics, economic, like that. Do you believe so? Do you believe that children are that empty? Is that an empty vase that we have to just pull with a lot of information so they can think? Or are they aware at that age of all those things that are surrounding them?
So I certainly don't agree with this view. I'm not sure if the right way to express it is they are aware. We have to help them be aware. And that's the whole purpose of this presentation. So one of the most common beliefs, and this is demonstrated in different studies, is that people believe, mainly, let's say, we adults believe that learners should have mastered the language in order to engage with critical literacy, in order to engage with social justice discussions. That is one of the most common beliefs. And the other one is that we think that, for example, these issues of sexuality, gender equity, justice are topics that are inappropriate for children because there is a presumed idea of innocence. Okay, but again, they are still facing these problems and they still have to deal with that on their own ways. And there's no such thing. So this is actually one of the ideas presented by Barbara Comber, which argued that there is nothing such as innocence in terms of children. and they are not immature to deal with it, because they wonder and they ask themselves every time, they are asking themselves about everything that they live. And we are not helping them with the answers, and we are not helping them to cope with that. So one of the things, yes, sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. So one of the things that we can say here is that we are training children to be aware. We are training children to be autonomous. So we are telling children to identify their own identity, their own realities, right? So many teachers, probably, they would say like, oh, that is not possible. For real, children cannot do that. But you're all teaching English in primary school, right? Are you a primary school teacher? So in that sense, do you believe so? In your own practice, do you feel it as such?
No, I don't feel this way. I definitely believe that children are 100% capable of coping with these topics and managing a complex discussion. So one of the things that we have to start believing as teacher and as educator is that literacy or critical literacy is not a higher intellectual skills. It is a matter and it is a responsibility of all of us to guarantee that all learners have or gain access to all sorts of literacy practices, including those that might be complicated for us to address in the classroom. So that is one of the things, because even if we delay the introduction of critical literacy, children will still experience violence. Children will continue to be neglected. Children will continue to watch in Netflix or in the children's book that they encounter problematic ideologies. It is better if they have proper scaffolding of their literacy skills so they can be able to understand them and make sense of their realities. Because anyway, they are asking all the time and they are wondering why there is violence in the world. Why, for example, one of the news that I read this week was a very violent discrimination case on a primary schools against Venezuelans here in Colombia. And children are wondering why. Why are we being violent? Or why is that kid being violent with the Venezuelan kid? And they are not receiving an answer. And these are things that are certainly a concern of schools.
All right. This is probably your experience, but is there any other experiences around the world, actually in Latin American studies, that have demonstrated that the use of critical literacy in early childhood could promote something good for kids?
Yeah, so definitely I'm not only talking from my own experience. So from my own experience, I have encountered that children are very capable, but there are other studies that also support this. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, unfortunately, this is not at the top of the research agenda of critical literacy. So if you look at the literature, most of the literature about critical literacy is based on teenagers and adults, or proficient learners, proficient language learners, whatever that means.
Is there any reason for that?
Yeah, so mainly because of the beliefs that we have already covered. So there more than that, there are many things that difficult the introduction of critical literacy in the classroom. So there are many challenges that we still have to overcome. First of all, the belief that it is a higher intellectual skills that is only for proficient language learners, and they don't, and that we believe that children don't have enough linguistic resources to engage in these critical discussions. Second, that it is inappropriate. And third, we also have the constraints, the school's constraints. And sometimes teachers find themselves limited and restricted because they have to meet curriculum demands. And a curriculum do not open enough space for teachers to address these sorts of topics. So teachers are too worried about a standardized text that they have to prepare their kids to take, and they don't find enough time and enough opportunity in the curriculum to cover all of these problems and to introduce critical literacy practices, because it's something that takes time. It's something that takes time, and unfortunately, schools have a lot of expectations about language teaching that don't necessarily embraces the integration of language and politics.
It seems that there are too many layers to cover this. So can we say that in Colombia, let's call it Colombia this case, the policies are not certainly helping teachers to unpackage those theories in order to transform their practices. But at the same time, can we say that teachers are afraid of doing that because they've got to respond to too many things the government is asking for and the institutions, and they don't have enough time, probably resources or knowledge in order to run this type of theories and practices? What do you reckon?
All right, so now that you're talking about teachers, Juan, so there are two situations. One is that teachers are not yet prepared to unpack these meanings of the text with children, but it is rather a problem of the adults not knowing how to address it, because we believe it's difficult. Oh, how am I going to talk about rape with a girl? Okay, with a young girl. So it is rather our problem rather than the kids' problem, because young children can become expert. They can become expert in their language and literacy practices with enough scaffolding and with enough support. Another problem that teachers face is that the beliefs of the schools and the parents community. So there is still a lot of restriction at schools, not only from the end of the coordinators or administrators, but also from parents, because it can be considered a threat to their ideologies and to their own personal beliefs. So teachers have the big challenge of resisting these and start finding spaces in their classroom to deal with these topics and guaranteeing that children are having a fair access to literacy practices, because they are very capable. So studies have demonstrated that they are very capable of challenging these dominant ideologies, and they are capable of understanding gender inequity. There is a girl called Cho. She's from Korea, and she worked storytelling gender-themed books. She did storytelling with gender-themed books in which the gender roles were switched. And by the end of the research, she was able to demonstrate that kids understood how these social arrangements were unfair with their moms, for example. And they acknowledged that they can also go to work, that their fathers could also cook, for example. And this looked like very simple conclusions, but for a kid it's a big achievement. And for us as teachers, it's also a big achievement, because it means that that in some way we are becoming our classroom a space for emancipation and a space to fight and to help with the establishment of justice.
Let me step back a bit. We cannot say that we have to neglect the linguistic part of the language in second language learning or additional language learning or foreign language learning, whatever you want to call it, right? But what we need to do is to include these other side of the language that we haven't explored that much. Is that right? So we ought to combine the prescriptivist perspective of the language with the descriptive perspective of the language, or do we have to separate it? What is it like?
So one of the things that we have to understand is that, yes, the linguistic and the forms and functions of the language are still relevant. They are still relevant, but they should not be the center of the class or of the critical literacy learning process, because it will happen while you establish discussion with your kids. Rather than thinking or worrying too much about grammar, forms, and functions, there are many strategies that we can implement as teachers to integrate critical literacy in the classroom. I'm going to share, and while I do it, I think I'm going to answer your questions as well. I'm going to share some strategies to start concluding with the presentation, some strategies and some considerations that we need to have in order to integrate critical literacy. So I'm going to start with the first one that is related to what you were asking, Juan, and is that we cannot forbid and we cannot restrict the use of their native language or the first language. We cannot neglect and we cannot ignore the reality that children have diverse linguistic resources, not only from English, which is the target language in most of our cases, but also they come with linguistic resources from Spanish. Some of the kids are exposed to other languages. Some of the kids belongs to indigenous communities and they are in touch with indigenous languages. We need to acknowledge that language diversity. We want to help them feel confident to talk and to discuss and to deconstruct text ideologies. So we cannot ban the use of other languages in the classroom. Sometimes we're too worried about the use of the target language in our classrooms, and we believe that that is the only way that they're going to learn, and that's not true. From my experience, I encourage my students to use either English or Spanish when there are little kids and when they are making sense of complex discussions. And by the end of the term, they usually demonstrate to improve their language competence as well, in the target language, of course. But they need to use the other resources as learning affordances as well.
What do you mean when you're talking about complex discussions with children? What could teachers understand by that?
Well, complex discussions doesn't mean controversial, which some people might confuse the term with that. Complex discussions means that you are going to challenge the children's beliefs and you are going to make them uncomfortable. And that's something that we have to do if we want to help them and scaffold their literacy skills to a critical awareness. So we need to bring complex conversations. We need to challenge their ideology. So one of the things that this girl I was talking before, Cho, did with the gender theme books was precisely that. She made children feel uncomfortable because she presented some books that the princess was the one that saved the prince, or there is a very famous book that is called What Mommies Do Best and What Daddies Do Best, in which they present what mommies and daddies do, and there is no difference between them. And children felt uncomfortable because they were taught differently at home. That is complex because you have to be very careful and you have to give children enough time to take critical stances. Okay, you have to give them enough time. Critical literacy is not a one-class activity. It should be something for a long learning period if you want to give them enough time to cope with these and to unpack all of these topics. That is why it is so important to use culturally responsible theme books that acknowledges the great diversity of the children's context.
That's a very nice idea. But what about those books, quite famous books that teachers are using every single time? They are totally stereotyping, yes, and not probably positively, but negatively. So how can you select a book that could be probably free of those charges?
I think the question is not how to choose them, but how to work with them. Because you can choose a stereotype book and have your kids agree or disagree with the ideas presented in the book. And you can take a lot of different activities, bring a lot of multimodal and diverse activity, writing and reading activities that can help them to unpack and get to the conclusion that that book is probably not representing the best reality, or is not empowering people, rather it is affecting certain population communities. So I think you have to choose carefully a book that you are aware that you have the capacity to work and to unpack it with your kids. And it also depends on the reality and the identities of your particular group.
So what's the role of the teacher? It seems quite complex. And I would believe it's complex every single time we are working in school or universities or whatever. So when we just work with critical literacy in early childhood education, so the scope is not on teachers, but on learners. But what's the role of teachers?
Teachers should mediate with the process that children are going to undertake in order to develop a critical attitude in the classroom. So something that is very important to understand is that we are not there to prescribe beliefs. So we are not in the classroom to impose ideologies. We need to help them get there by themselves. We cannot tell them, oh, yes, you have to think like this book is not okay because it's a stereotype or whatever. We need to help them to get there through posing questions, through posing different discussion, engaging your kids with diverse writing activities, not only drawing, but also doing a lot of painting, multimodal construction, discussing with their classmates. So we need to bring to the classroom different activities. That is why it is important to start putting together and to help schools to put together a well-designed syllabus with a great variety of reading and writing activities over an extended periods of time, so children can have different learning opportunities in order to get to their own conclusions.
That's the role of teachers, but teachers being told when they are studying at uni, right, that they have to run activities in the traditional way, so students would learn something that they are expected to learn. It seems to be that teachers in primary school education or early childhood education is just working on the mere fact of the manipulative function of the language, which I would believe, as you've been saying, is going to be the heuristic function of the language. So what else can teachers do going against, emancipating themselves from uni topics, let's call it like that, probably, I'm not justified with that. How can they emancipate and start working in different form with their children, with their students?
First of all, we need to be equipped with our own critical literacy skills. So, because if we are not critical ourselves, it's going to be very hard to fight the institutional demands. And second, we need to start open up spaces in the classroom. And I think that's a very hard question because there is not a exact formula for this yet. There's still much to be done. And I think the first thing that needs to change is the teacher's belief. So we need to start believing in our children. We need to start believing that they are capable of achieving a lot of things and of developing a critical attitude in the classroom. So we need to be aware that if we don't cover these topics in our classroom, they are going to deal with it probably without the support of their parents, and that will become totally the opposite of what we want in order to establish a more equal society. So it's very hard. So what should teachers do? That's the big question. So I think the first thing is to start resisting from your own classrooms. Sometimes I know that we have to meet with a lot of demands. I myself find in that situations, because the language curriculum that I have to address in with my kids is very restricted to forms and functions of the language. But still, what I used to do is to take the thematic units and spare moments in each of the classes to address the problems around the thematic unit. So, for example, I remember that this year with third grade, I had a unit related to landscapes, and they had to learn there is a lake, there is a volcano. It was very functional center. Okay, but what I did was to expand the discussion and start talking about ecosystems with them. And I started, I took them around the school to look for bugs, and then kind of to help them to be sensible around for their surroundings, and to take care and to care about the problems. And then we expanded this discussion and these activities towards discussing environmental problems and the political roles that each of us has when it comes to environment. So I found the space. I still cover there is, there are, etc., which was what the school wants me to. But I also integrated a different discussion without forgetting the linguistic part. So I think we need to start ourselves opening spaces. We have to start from there, and then we can perhaps escalate that yes, that resistance attitude to a higher level, maybe to start showing results and start establishing a dialogue with coordinators and with administrative educators.
Maria Camila, I think we are running out of time. Are we?
Yes.
So I would like to thank you. Yes, it was definitely a very nice talk. If you teachers are looking forward to get some extra information, please contact us. We can definitely share with you our experience with this topic. Maria Camila, how would you just wrap up this very short talk we already got? Please,
well,
say your words.
Just to conclude, there's one thing that I want to share with everyone today, and is that the purpose of the presentation was not to give you a formula for teaching, because we all have to find ways to bring this up, and we all have to find ways to keep working on this. And critical literacy is something that shouldn't be another skill or another competence or another subject in the curriculum. It should be seen as an attitude, okay, as an attitude across the curriculum and across the whole learning process, from the very first moment of school till the very last. As Vasquez, Young, and Converse said, I highly recommend to read this article. Critical literacy should be a way of being, living, learning, and teaching. It shouldn't be only a subject or a skill.
Or an approach.
Or an approach, yes, definitely.
Thank you very much for being here today. Once again, if you want to contact us, it will be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.